ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how. Well, hello there, my fellow FileMaker developers and enthusiasts. This is Matt Petrowski bringing you these FileMaker tutorials over at my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video tutorial, we're doing a hands-on walkthrough and we're taking a look at FileMaker's Inspector tool. I figured I'd walk through each section, and for this one, we're taking a look at the Position tab. What I'm going to do is walk through each of the areas of the Inspector tool and tell you pretty much anything and everything that I know about using that aspect of FileMaker Pro. Let's take a look at the file. Alright, so here we go. Now, there really isn't a file that I'm providing you with. If you'd like to follow along and keep up with going through the Inspector tool, then you can just go to the File menu in your copy of FileMaker, choose New Solution, and that's all I have is just a blank solution. I've opted to name it Inspector Tool just because that's a tool we're going through, but this is basically just an expose of the tool and me talking about all the things that I understand about the database. Now, this field picker, that may come up on your FileMaker file. If not, then it won't be there. Just hide it. We're not interested in that. So we're going to go to the View menu, and it's the Inspector that we're actually interested in right here. Now, one thing to note when you're using FileMaker's Inspector tool, it is the primary way that we interact with a lot of things within FileMaker, primarily in layout mode, since that's where it's available. Now, the Inspector, as you see right here, does have a command key. If you're working on a laptop, it's nice to be able to show and hide that if you don't have the real estate, so you can just Command I that or Control I, back and forth. Another interesting thing is with the Inspector, if you didn't notice it, you can choose to have a new Inspector. So it's very possible to have multiple. I have worked in both ways with the Inspector tool, such as this, where you have one tab on one, and hey, you can go for all four if you'd like. I can create a new inspector and put another one right here. If you've got two monitors and you think this is a great way to work, then recognize that you can do this in FileMaker. You can basically have every single one of the inspector tools showing. Of course, I'm not a big fan of that. You can hide it all with Command I. You can bring them all back with Command I. In order to close them individually, you of course you're going to close them. Now, I like to use just the one inspector tool. If you don't know, FileMaker used to have each of the tabbed areas identified. They just recently turned it into icons, so it's a little bit confusing. You don't know which area is which. I just think of them as Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, and Section 4 because they correspond with the command keys. If you do Command 1, it'll go to Section 1, Command 2, Command 3, Command 4, and likewise, and you can flip between any of the sections as needed. So we're going to be going through the first section right here and talking about all of the different things that we have available in this part of the inspector. Now, right off the bat, the first thing that we're going to see is the Position subsection of the Position tab. And the one all-important feature is being able to name objects. Now, of course, if I select the text tool, which I've done right there, and I click to add the text, for some reason my text isn't showing right there until I actually drag it out. We notice that we get all of our measurements by actually dragging our object, which is really nice. All of our positioning will update accordingly, and I can, of course, position this. One really helpful thing is that when dragging nowadays in FileMaker, it actually shows you with that tooltip as you drag. That's most useful when you're dealing with button bars and you want to know what size each of their individual segments are. Let's take a look at that. So I'll drag out a button bar, and we can see right here button bar setup is going to come up, but I'll close that. As I drag, notice that it's telling me the segment. Now, of course, all of our measurement system is displayed right there, and inches in this particular situation is not very convenient or helpful to me. So the one thing that we're going to be able to do in the toolbar is control the measurement system. That's almost the first thing that I do on any FileMaker file, is I will click, and it doesn't matter where, here, 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 or here. You can pretty much click on any of those, and what it will do is it will toggle through the three available measurements that FileMaker provides. It'd be nice if we could have a few more than that, maybe be able to right-click and get a context menu, but we have points, which is most useful when designing for the user interface. and then inches or centimeters depending on your locale when you're designing for a printed form or something that's actually going to be output. So the first thing I do is switch to that measurement system, mostly because I'm doing a lot of user interface design in FileMaker. Now, as I was covering the name, the all-important name for an object or a grouped object allows us to interact with things on the user interface. We have refresh object script step. We have many different things that allow us to go to a given object. Here is my preferred method for naming objects. Whatever that object is named in FileMaker, that is the prefix that it will get. So for example, with the text object, I would name it text dot and then whatever applies. So if it's a field, then that would be named field, and then whatever the field is, if it was necessary and I was using the go to object script step. If it's a portal, it would be portal dot whatever that portal does. Maybe it's invoices. And of course, if it's a button bar, I don't really type the whole word button bar out. I tend to type bar. And if it is a given segment, I will call that a segment because that's what FileMaker calls it. And for your tab panels, I used to call them tabs, but now I call them panel. That's just because that's what FileMaker does. And of course, button is very easy. Button dot click me or whatever it is. I think you get the idea on that one. Now the tooltip is pretty straightforward. It's easy. See this when you hover. I should put in the word you. And of course, that needs to be in quotes because it is a FileMaker calculation. Now, the one thing, if you have not been using FileMaker for a long period of time, FileMaker has been making a slow transition in its user interface. And sometimes you will see this little pencil icon, which will allow you to access the calculation dialog box. Other times you will actually see a button that will be labeled specify. And those are the two different ways that FileMaker is identifying how you can access a calculation dialog box when you're editing something. So for example, here I have the full access to the calculation engine in order to specify a tooltip. Here comes a nice little trick or tip that I've done on this particular situation. One thing that FileMaker does not have is it does not have a on-hover event. However, if you are adventurous enough and you would like to know whether or not it's possible, it is possible to trigger a script when you hover over something. In particular, using this tooltip feature to actually access a plugin function. So it would look like this. You'd have a plugin function call that might be something where you can actually specify a script name, put the T there, and then maybe also a parameter that goes to that script. So you can use the tooltip and the fact that you can trigger a plugin, you can trigger a script via a plugin. But in that scenario, you would have to have the plugin on the copy of FileMaker Pro, the client that is, and unfortunately this would not work on FileMaker Go. So that is a nice little tip if you're going to use tooltips. Now, my next favorite area is the position. Not only does this allow you to align all of your objects, but it is great for basically taking objects from one layout to another. I am constantly having an object, and of course we can align these objects as we will see, but if this is on one layout, and then I go to another layout, I of course have a couple of different ways that I can align them. Number one, I can turn on my rulers and I can drag out guides, and I would have a guide going along this edge or a guide along this front, and I would be able to place this object right up into the corner of that guide. But a lot of the times adding guides arbitrarily just makes your user interface, or at least when you're working on the layout, a little more complex and just sort of junky. So I don't always add guides for that unless it fits the design that I'm working on. Better yet, I just select here and I will copy one of the values, such as 33 for the left, and I will remember that the top is 96. I will then go to my other layout, simply select my object after pasting, highlight, paste in the value, and then simply tab to type in 69, or 96 is actually what it was, 96, in order to get that object exactly where it was on the other layout. Remember, users don't like it when things shift. You can notice a shift even with 1 pixel, so make sure and align those right on each other when you're moving from layout to layout. Of course, the width and height are really nice. Here's a little tip that I like to use. One of the things that you can do is you can select the body parts and you can give them a very low value in the height category. For example, if I just input the value of 1 right now and simply hit a return, what's going to happen is it used to be the case that FileMaker would actually shrink this up to the smallest of the objects that it could get. And in fact, what happened there is it looked like it ate those objects up. Now, there is an issue that came along when we hit the transition from the .fp7 to the .fp12 format. If you worked with a version prior to FileMaker 12, then you're familiar with the fact that you did not have to deal with decimal-based positioning of objects. So when we select this layout part, it's very likely that you can drag this, and what happens is when you're resizing things, many times you can get a decimal value in terms of an object. So when I select this body part, if I was to put in a height of 400.43562 whatever, blah, 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 FileMaker will definitely work based on that system. And you will see in your FileMaker solution oftentimes that things will get shifted by point values. It's a bit of a hassle, and the only thing that I know in order to address that is to simply go in, select your layout parts, identify them to be the height that you want them, and then simply resize them. So if I want this to be 400, then I want to select each of the parts and recognize that they are whole number values. Once they go to point values, it becomes a little bit of a hassle to realign those. But remember, you can always select on a single object in your layout, hold down the Tab key, and cycle through all of the different positionable items, including the layout parts themselves. So there you go. Next, we have the AutoSizing. Now, this is one thing that if I can convey anything in this video, it is please, please, please become familiar with AutoSizing and how it works. We live in a modern day of modern UI, and having objects shift and adjust as you scale windows out or as devices are reoriented, that's standard. Users expect that. But day after day, I will see FileMaker databases where users have not taken advantage of this feature. They simply just design their user interface with everything up in the left corner, and by default, FileMaker anchors everything to the top and the left. By all means, please use the AutoSizing, and it works as such. As I zoom out and make this is text and make it much larger, please recognize how FileMaker's anchoring works. First off, let's make this a little bit smaller in terms of the width of the layout, and watch how we can use the anchoring. Number one, as we drag, we get our guides. But number two, if I was to anchor this text to the top and the left, and I go into browse mode, notice that the layout is getting chopped off, or it's basically showing the smallest area of the layout because of the anchoring. Let's contrast that with anchoring it to the bottom and the left and turning off the top and the right, or the bottom and the right, excuse me. When we go into browse mode, of course, as we drag, it's going to stay anchored into that bottom area. Now, here's a little trick. If you are going to align everything up in the top, it is possible to have an off-screen object, and that off-screen object will apply to FileMaker's anchoring. So notice as I resize the layout out, everything sizes out because of that off-screen object. So FileMaker pays attention to that as well. If you want to center something within your layout, the only way that you can do that is to turn off all anchorings in the AutoSizing, go into browse mode, and that object will stay in the center of your layout. And it will, of course, automatically have this resize out as well. So pay attention to using the AutoSizing. Of course, if you're going to have something like a sidebar, and that sidebar needs to be able to grow with the layout, you're going to probably turn off your right-based anchoring, and maybe you'll have an object as such. But definitely take advantage of this feature or this functionality of FileMaker. Make sure that when you're going to do this, you get a really nice looking layout so that everything resizes. I should have turned my line on here. Really quick little visit. Let me turn on the line for you here so we can see what's happening. Make it red and we'll go into browse mode. So there we go. That is an auto-sizing layout. You know, the sidebar is growing as we drag down. This visible area is growing as we grow out. It should be super obvious to use these anchors, and please do use them. Now the next thing that we have, again, I can't live without the ability to arrange and align. Now you may be thinking, I understand all of these. Yes, I do. This is your spacing ability to distribute your objects. It should be obvious. And then these are your resizing objects. Now the one thing that I will give you as a tip is that it is really beneficial when you have multiple objects. Let me get rid of some of these. Is that you be able to, let's say I have a different sized text object right there, and then I've got another object right here, and it's big. I've got 3 different objects, and I would like to align all of these and space them equally in a very quick fashion. Of course, that would look like this. If I marqueed and selected on all of these objects, I would be able to align them left, and then I would have to choose which one here is the resize to largest. That's resize to smallest. That's resize to largest. Okay, I want the largest. I want to also resize to that one, and I want to drag this one and then select all of them and then distribute them equally. So you can see that that took a little bit of time in order for me to accomplish that. I'll do a lot of Command Z's in order to get everything back to how it was before, and I want you to see how quickly I can do this by simply just having the fact that I've got keys assigned to all of these shortcuts in order to make that happen much quicker. So if possible, learn your shortcuts on Windows and in particular on Mac. If you're going to, go to the Arrange menu and notice that in the Align and Distribute, it is possible on the Macintosh to assign key equivalents to all of the different alignment options, left edges, top edges, middle, and resizing as well. You can see that I take the opportunity to use the arrow keys for pretty much everything, but I simply change the modifier key to the Control and Option versus the Align, where I just have the Option typically. So if you will take the time to set those keys, and if you're on a Macintosh, you can do that in the Preferences setting, not in the Preferences of FileMaker, excuse me, but in the Preferences of the system. In the keyboard area, under Shortcuts, under App Shortcuts, you will find that you can add FileMaker Pro Advanced. Click on the plus right here if you need to. In order to add additional shortcuts, all you need to do is put a menu name that exactly matches the menu name of what you're wanting it to do. So under the Arrange, the menu name of left edges, centers, right edges, top edges, middle, bottom, etc. have all been assigned keyboard equivalents in order for me to be able to align objects rapidly and with precision. So it's a very cool thing that I love about the auto-sizing. And also the Arrange and the Align. Now one thing to remember, the group and the arrange. Everything on a FileMaker layout happens in terms of its stacking order. In other words, this piece of text may very well likely come before this piece of text. It is not presented in the order in which you see the objects. This is not object 1, 2, and then 3. As far as FileMaker is concerned, this could be number 1, this could be number 2, and this could be number 3. It is all dependent on their stacking order. So as I select this one and choose the Send to Back, that becomes object number 1 now. And if I start hitting the Tab key, FileMaker is going to cycle from it to whatever is the next most object. So that happens to be this one is number 2. Then we have number 3, and after it's finished with its objects on the layout, it's going to move to a body part, which it probably just did. It moved to the header, then to the body, then to the footer. So yes, layout parts are part of the tab cycle, But of course, I can send this one to the back now, and now when I tab, this becomes the second, the third, and so forth. So remember that arranging is based on the tab stacking order. Now what I know about that is there used to be a situation where if you were going to use FileMaker's calculations in order to set variables or do all kinds of tricky things, sometimes I do those tricky things in my other videos, then knowing the stacking order was beneficial because sometimes you would have to, in order to accomplish some type of workaround or trick, sending an object to the back or the bottom of the layout. Now, the group is something that I'm actually not too fond of myself. Yes, it's nice to be able to group objects, and there is a nice little ability to apply a universal setting to it, but the problem with grouping things in FileMaker is that it obscures things in many cases. For example, with this object selected, I can give this object a name, such as text box 1. I can also select this object and call it text.box 2. Those names are useful and I need to know those names, but in the context of grouping, as soon as I select both of those, and I zoom out and then zoom in, if I group those objects right there, there's the ungroup object, or the ungroup, and we do have menu commands for those. You notice that I am now able to give these objects their own name as a group. So if I call them group text boxes, the problem with this situation that I find is that the underlying objects themselves are obscured. Now this will very likely be solved in a future version of FileMaker. But for right now, it is something that I'm not very fond of, because the only other way in order to find out what the names of these objects are is to use one of FileMaker's design functions to get all of the layout object names, and even then I don't know which one is which just because I have the names, because that doesn't come with their positional coordinates as well. So I'm not a very big fan of grouping, but there is one feature that you get when you group things, is that in the inspector, in the fourth tab section under the behavior, we can apply a hide object when to the whole of a group. The problem is if we put that onto this object, we say true, both of those boxes included in the group are going to hide. When I go into browse mode, yes, lo and behold, they will hide. But the second that I come in and select those objects and then decide to ungroup them, I will lose my hide visibility calculation. So when I say OK, that calculation has now been destroyed. So me, that's a little bit of a counterproductive behavior. So make sure if you're going to group, you know when, where, why, and for what reason you're going to be grouping things. My solutions, I rarely tend to group as it is. Now when it comes to FileMaker and printed output, or output in general, it could be to a PDF, which would be digital. This is where sliding and visibility comes into play. Everything here is what is controlling how objects should behave when output is going to be generated. We can see this by saying this box right here has a lot of extra space underneath it. If I was to print this layout, then I can decide what I want to have happen. We can see that I can choose sliding left, where this tells me with the tooltip that I will reduce the field width to fit data and slide objects left. Same with sliding up. This will slide up based on all objects above, only objects directly above, and I can also close the close the actual layout part. That would be the body right here, meaning everything would shrink up in between here. Now remember, this only deals with output, and I'm only going to be able to see this when I go into preview mode. So if we select all of these right here and slide up based on them and slide up based on them, I should be able to go into preview mode and see what happens. In this case, I don't know why those aren't showing. I'm not going to troubleshoot them right now. But when it comes to fields, that's what is going to happen. Maybe because of my anchoring right there. If I've got those funky anchorings, All of those objects were set to show up, and my window is large enough that it probably would have them out of screen. Let's go and preview now, see what happens. We still don't get our text. Not something that I'm really interested in troubleshooting as to why that text isn't showing, but I imagine we'd be able to figure it out at some point in time. Object visibility. This, unlike the visibility setting in our fourth area of our tab, deals only with printing. So if I was to check this, when this object is selected, this object will not print when I go into preview mode, provided it would be showing. I don't know why they're not showing, but I'll take a look at that and we'll show it at the end of this video. But for the most part, if you want to control visibility, you now have two places to do it when it comes to printing. The hide visibility calculation on the section 4 in the inspector, and this one as well. And finally, before we solve that little problem, we have our grid. If you have not used FileMaker's grid, then of course we have the ability to show our grid. Also turn on snapping to grid, which is very beneficial when you finally decide on your grid settings. Now for our grid settings, we have two of them. We have the major and the minor grid steps. When it comes to using these, I've dealt with a number of developers. Some developers only use the major grid spacing, and you can do that by simply setting your minor grid to the same distance as your major grid. And what happens is you get one actual grid. Actually, minor grid steps would be 0, my fault. And in order to do that, or 1, excuse me. And if you are going to use your minor grid spacing, then it's nice to use a multiple of whatever the major grid spacing is. So for example, if I was doing a FileMaker Go user interface, I might use something like 88 as my major grid spacing, and then maybe I want to split that down into 4. And what that's going to do is it gives me 44 so that I can drag an object, and when I'm snapping, I know that my snapping for every 2, I'm pretty much hitting an object of a height of 44, which is the target pixel height for a human touchable area on a touch device. So that's really nice when you're going to use the major and the minor combined. I always suggest that you pick a initial major and minor, but please know that you can change this at any point in time. If your design dictates that I also need to design on a 32 separated by a 2, then please use that. You, of course, can position your objects, you can lock them, and so forth. In fact, I skipped over the lock when we were in this section, or in this area. Let me cover that really quickly. The lock itself is really beneficial, or most beneficial, when you're dealing with on-screen tabs. If you have tab objects on your layout, we'll go 1, 2, 3, create those tabs and say OK. What's really nice is when you're trying to position things within the tab, I tend to like to lock my tab panels, because once those are locked, then I can of course drag things inside and out of them, and I can also marquee without them being selected. So I'm able to drag this now even though the locked object is selected. So that's a really nice feature of the lock, and that applies to anything that is a containment object. And our containment objects in FileMaker are, of course, the tab panel, sliders, popovers, and then portals. Anything that can contain an object, the way that you identify containment is when you drag the object. As soon as you drag outside of the boundary, if it goes invisible, you know that that object is contained by the object around it. So that's how we know that our object is within the containment object. All right, and just to show that I do know a little bit about what I'm talking about with regards to the sliding and the printing, I figured out my problem. Probably some of you clued into it, you advanced developers. I created this brand new file, and what I did not have is any records. If FileMaker doesn't have any records, then of course, what's there to preview? So I had to go into browse mode. I had to create at bare minimum at least one record. So if this happens to you for some reason, that's what you have to have. And of course, the sliding and printing, that really only deals with fields. So with this field selected over here in the inspector palette, as I zoom down, the remove blank space by sliding left, sliding up really only applies to fields. As we can see, that the text block objects themselves are not going to resize. We can turn on the auto resize and closing part. But when we go into browse mode here, or excuse me, preview mode, we're going to see that the space that was underneath the field itself shrunk up, where the text blocks themselves did not shrink up. And there's very little settings that we can actually set in order to control that. Let's see if we can change it to all objects directly above. And we can't really get that to shrink, but it does shrink on the field itself. So of course, designing your reports, if you're going to have data on the reports, sometimes it's more advantageous to use fields than it may be to use merge fields, which would look like this. That was some expansion text. And so if we're showing data like this, we don't get the advantage if we're outputting that form with regards to the sliding and the visibility when it comes to printing, and the fact that fields themselves will shrink up. All right, so that's going to bring this video to a wrap. We've gone through the first of the 4 areas. I will say that the second of the areas, the styles, that is our most boring area of the inspector palette. There is some use to it, but I'll probably combine it and the third area, the appearance tab, together in my next video. So as always, I hope you've learned more about FileMaker, picked up a tip or a trick while you watch this video. As always, I'd like to wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy FileMaking.
We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.